Jewish Community Center of Amherst, and we're filming my exhibit, which has been up for the last 3 months and is coming down today. What you're looking at right now is an eye through a lens of a set of glasses, and it's my eye, and it's my glasses. So what you see here in the middle hanging down, and I'm going to blow through some holes on the side here so that you can see what happens. There's some little things that are dangling there. Those are windows. And this piece is called Windows to My Soul, using the idea of the eye is the window to the soul. I went straight for the windows, and the eye you see. These 3 little hanging pieces have windows, or things like windows, on both sides. They're hanging by a thread, and it's not really a thread, they're hanging by a hair, and it's my hair. It's one of my gray hairs, and it's amazingly strong, actually. But memories often hang only by a hair, and this piece is really about how we become who we are, dependent on the lenses with which we see the world and we learn about the world. And one of those lenses, well, it's clearly the glasses I wear are essential to my understanding of my world, but it's also, metaphorically, the ways we have of seeing things, and the places we have been, and the windows that we have looked through. One of these is the window that my father saw the world through when he was 3 years old and he came from Odessa to Paris. And I went to visit it because I was visiting one of his cousins, and she said, of course, they lived around the corner. So I went to see, and I got into the main door of the building and found myself facing a courtyard, but with a big gate between me and the courtyard. And I was told that their apartment was the least expensive apartment in the building, the cheapest apartment. It was the ground floor at the end of the courtyard. And so there I was looking at it, and a man with a bicycle came in, and he said, did you want to come into the courtyard? I said, I do. And I explained why. He said, well, I live there. And I told him and what I was hoping to see, and he said, well, it's a modern place. There's nothing much to see, but I'll show it to you. So we went in, and indeed the apartment said nothing to me. But the minute I turned around and looked out the window into the courtyard, I understood that I was seeing the view, the same view that my father and my grandparents had seen, through the same window, the same mullions, and maybe even possibly the same glass. So that's what this is about. So in the last piece, I showed you something that related to my father and my past. Here are my children, or some of them anyway. I do embroidery, and these 3 pieces here are my 3 daughters. They're birth announcements, I guess. And each one has a different character. They don't necessarily correspond to the characters of the people, but I really love embroidery, and maybe you can do a close-up, Ken, of some of the work here. Over here, on the left, rather. These are both of them called Mizrach, and they are found in a Jewish home. Some piece of folk art that has the word Mizrach in it. Mizrach means east. Jews pray in the direction of the east. And so traditional homes would have some piece of artwork that would let you know which direction was east if you were a visitor to the home. This one is done as an applique of 2 felts, and the letters come out from behind. I also collect buttons, so these are my buttons that are in the greens and the yellows. And the one on top is a paper cut. Many cultures have this traditional folk art. They can be simple or very intricate. This one is pretty intricate. The word Mizrach is in the middle in Hebrew. And there's a bird and a fish. And it's not something I do a lot of. And now I'll move on to something else. Over here, we have a piece I call Encompassing Sukkot. I'd rather not tell you yet what Sukkot means if you don't know. I'd rather just focus on the word encompassing. And what this is encompassing is a whole bunch of different stories. I collected stories about a particular event by sending out a message on the internet and addressing my friends, and people sent me stories. And out of these stories, some of them really caught my imagination, others didn't. For the ones that did, I produced some kind of 3-dimensional image and collected all the stories together in this panel. It's about 4 feet tall and 2 feet wide, and it was one of 19 panels, but everybody's panel was very different, that was used several years back to decorate a sukkah at the National Yiddish Book Center in Amherst. And now a sukkah is a tabernacle, and the holiday of Sukkot, tabernacles, is in the fall after the 2 main holidays that are called the High Holidays. And it's the holiday that Thanksgiving is based on. So it's a harvest festival, and Jews build a little temporary hut, a structure, and it's open to nature, and they dwell in it for 7 days. But people's stories are so varied. Over on the 2 sides of the panel, if you can scan that for our audience, are the actual stories. So that if you want to know what this cat is doing, you go over to here and you see the thing that describes the cat in somebody's story, or what this chair with an M16 is doing. Then you go over to here, and there's the story of that. The story that I received for that was a very simple story, but I needed an M16 leaning up against a chair. And I hesitate to say this, but to find the M16 was easy, unfortunately. You just go to any toy store, and you have little soldiers with M16s. But the chair, to find a chair that was the right scale, that was hard. And so I had to make that chair. So each of these boxes represents not 1, but sometimes 3 stories. This, I think, is 4. This is 3. That's 1. This is 2. And the reason there's a compass in the middle, because we're encompassing Sukkot, is because, as I said to you before, with the Mizrach, the sign that shows you which direction is east, Jews in prayer and in rituals need to know which direction east is. They start by taking the palm branch, which is the signal, the piece of the holiday ritual that is the most recognizable, the 4 species, and we call it an etrog. In English, it's called a citron, and we shake the lulav. This is called the lulav, starting with the east. So here I put at the center of all this a compass. And here are the stories. Now, collecting stories is a wonderful thing. It's you get to know people, and then putting all these disparate people who do not know each other all into one piece. Now it becomes mine. And the truth is, you don't need to know what the stories are to look at this piece and enjoy it, or get some delight from it some way or the other. You don't need to know what it was for. You just look and say, wow, look at these interesting, odd things all together. And my eye is the one that decides how big that box needed to be, or how narrow that box needed to be. This is made from balsa wood, stained balsa wood, all the pieces that you see inside. And the sides on the outside I constructed from planks of wood in lumber yards. Not the ones you buy, but the ones that are used to protect the good lumber that's being sold from the straps that are put around them. And I said, that's just what I need. Could you sell me that? He said, you can have that, lady. So hanging from here is when I hang this up in a non-public place. I have a little crib sheet with all of these stories hanging. It's quite heavy, and what you see up here is a story. You see these keys up there? So you see three garlands. One of them is made of keys. One of them is a miniature version of holiday cards. People sent holiday cards. So people talked about decorating the sukkah with different things. And one of them said, we take all our holiday cards and hang them across. And somebody else made garlands. We've all made those garlands. But one story was an older man said when he was a little boy, they had very little, and his mother had a whole bunch of old keys. And she said, why don't you take these keys and make a decoration? So he made a garland. I like that story. Often you wonder what this basket is doing here. The basket with food and dishware and inside. People would live in apartment buildings, and they would build their sukkah down in the courtyard or in the backyard of the apartment building. And so they would create a pulley system so that they would bring the food up and down in a basket. And so many people had a story about that. The flashlight has to do with one woman saying that when she was a young girl, her brothers would scare her. They would try to sleep in the sukkah. This was probably not in the city. And it was a big treat to be able to stay overnight in the sukkah. And the boys would scare her with scary stories. So she would take a flashlight to make herself feel safe. And that was her story. Now, this is another sort of collection. This is one person's collection. And I'm pointing up here, if you'll follow me up there. And it goes all the way down, across, and here. We'll look at it in more detail later. What this is one person's collection of fabrics. She kept clothes, towels, sheets, things of textile from her life. Her grandmother's best towels, her baby's crib sheets, clothes that remind her of different things. Her family was in the clothing industry. They made something we used to call house dresses and dressing gowns. And she saved all sorts of stuff. She had an event coming in her life. She was getting married, and her second marriage, and I said to her, I'll make something for you. I'll make a chuppah. And Jews marry under a canopy. And she brings me these fabrics, and they're not too exciting, and I can't quite see how to make a chuppah for her. And I said, maybe something different. Why would you want all of your past over your new husband and new future? So what I did was to make something that is a takeoff on something that the Etruscans from the period of the Romans, It's called a Liber Lenti, or Lentius. It's a linen book, and a friend of mine who was a textile curator told me about this. They would make a story about the person who had died, and they would write it on a long strip of linen, and then they would fold this strip of linen with the story of their life and put it under the head of the body when it was buried or put in a sarcophagus. And of course there's a big difference. This woman's not dying and she's getting married, but I thought that the idea worked. So this whole piece is about 13 inches high, and it goes for, I can't quite remember. It's probably about 27 feet. And you'll notice that one end here actually matches that end here and can be buttoned together. So if the room is the right size, it could be a small room, you could have this frieze all around. And you can separate it here. It comes apart, the button's there, and over here. Starting with the green, you can see I made sure that the pockets are visible. I stuck a little piece of fabric in the pockets. And then I play with the lines and the colors. And the recipient of this wanted to tell me about each fabric. And I said, no, don't tell me the stories. I'm going to order them in my own way. And as you'll notice, they go in color. So we start with these, here we're in the yellow family, and then we're going to get to the blacks and grays, and then to the purples, and then to the blues. But here's her grandmother's favorite towel, and here's a piece of garden furniture, upholstery, and then here's a blouse of hers. And someone who said to me, oh, look, I never realized how interesting sleeves can be. So we're coming over here, and we have some more sleeves, as you can see, a whole bunch of them. And here's a piece of one of those dressing gowns and a bathing suit. And here's her father's jacket. Now, the jacket was not particularly interesting, but the inside actually had more character with the lining and with the label. And I stuck something in the pocket. And we continue. Here's some more of that upholstery again. Here's something in the pocket again. And here we are with sleeves again. And then, as I pointed out before, this last one, this green one here, matches with the other green one over there. So we've looked at a collection of stories from different people all in one place, and now all in one place, the collections of one person's story. Well, here we are with another long strip of fabric. The one above us was one person's collection of stories from her whole life, and the one right behind me is the story also of one person. And this one is Isaac from the Bible, the patriarch Isaac. And why Isaac? Okay, so I was asked by a museum in Philadelphia to participate in an exhibit on wimples. Now you may think, what's a wimple? A wimple is, well, it's also, it's this, but it's also this long strip of fabric that nuns wear, or used to wear, to cover their heads. And sometimes it had some decorative form to it. It would be starched and would take shape. But their whole hair would be completely covered. And that's actually a theme we'll get back to later, the covering of hair. So this is a long strip of fabric, and it comes from the German, which means a wimple is a pennant, like a flag. So back in the 1600s in southern Germany, the Jews started a folk art tradition of creating a piece of homemade embroidery artwork that would be signaling the weaning of their children. So they would take the swaddling clothes from the ceremony of the circumcision of their boys, and they would rip the fabric and sew it into long strips, and then they would embroider a blessing with the boy's name on it. And the blessing would say something like the name of the child and who he's a son of, and the date of the birth, and then the wish that God will raise him to Torah, Chuppah, and Ma'asim Tovim, which means to Torah, meaning to learning the law and the wisdom of our tradition, the Bible, the laws, and then to Chuppah, which means to marriage, and to Ma'asim Tovim, to good deeds. Amen. That's what they would embroider. So it was a way of the housewife, the mother, to show off her needlework skills. Later on in the 1800s, more wealthy women, not eager to spend their time doing embroidery perhaps, would hire a local artist to paint. Now, this wimple also has a name which describes what it's for. We haven't told you what they used it for in the synagogue. So they would bring it as a gift when the child was 3 or whenever the child was weaned. It was used to wrap the Torah, and it's called a Torah binder. The Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible, and it's what Jews roll and unroll and roll and read from in the synagogue every Saturday all over the world, and we're all reading the same text all over the world on the same day. And so when you roll up this big roll in two directions of being rolled up, it needs to be tied together so it doesn't fall down. It's safe. And then it'll get covered with a beautiful cloth as well. So this is a Torah binder. Over here is actually the beginning of the story, but starting at the other end, you start rolling and you end here, and then the ties would be tied around to hold it shut. So, in the spirit of it being the mother of the child making this binder, I decided to have the mother of this child, and the child I picked was Isaac because of the story that's in the center of this piece, which I've been covering for the moment, because of the story of the binding of Isaac, which you probably all know. So Abraham is being tested. God says, take your beloved son and basically go up to the top of a mountain and sacrifice him. The angel's voice comes when he sees that Abraham is prepared to do that and says, Abraham, Abraham, stop. And in the thicket nearby, they find a ram, and that's the animal they sacrifice. So based on this idea of the Torah binder and the binding of Isaac, I chose Isaac for this exercise for the museum. And what you see is that the binder is 7 inches tall and 7 feet long. And here I have done an illusion. I've made it look like the Torah binder gets squeezed smaller and tighter and wrapped around Isaac, and then comes back out again in full. So there are 5 scenes here. So starting over on the far right is Sarah, his mother, and I've given her a paintbrush. And for those of you who know your Genesis story, here it is. The 3 angels, or the 3 messengers, the 3 men come, and Abraham is known for his hospitality. He invites them in. His wife makes a meal for them, and Abraham washes their feet. That becomes the symbol of hospitality. And one of the messengers says to Sarah, this time next year, you will have a son. Now, that seemed very odd to her because she was already in her 90s and they never had had children. She had never had children. So this was a real miracle. Right here in very small, can you see that? all of this is Hebrew. This is Hebrew as is written in the scroll. It's the line that I just quoted. This time next year, you will have a son. Traditionally, this is the piece that would be embroidered, and this is his name. Isaac, son of Abraham and Sarah, was born under a good constellation. I'll read it for you in Hebrew. It says Yitzchak, which is Isaac, ben Avraham, son of Abraham, ve Sarah, and Sarah. Nolad b'mazal tov, is born under Mazal Tov. You probably all have heard people say Mazal Tov, which sounds like it's saying congratulations, which is what it's saying, but it literally means under a good constellation. And then to continue this is script, this is Hebrew script, this is the traditional date of his birth. Don't ask me how I got that was complicated. And over on this side, if you follow me, the blessing continues, a shorthand for the name of God, because we don't write God's name. God will raise him to Torah, Chuppah, Ma'asim Tovim, Ma'asim Tovim. I've already translated that for you. And over here it says, Amen, Selah. Now back to this second scene. So here we have the second scene from Isaac. He's going up the mountain with his father, and he's carrying the wood. This is straight from the Bible. And he says, well, I've got the wood, Dad, and you've got the fire, and where is the sacrificial lamb? And of course that's a cruel moment there, a little sad. But the next one is the really emblematic moment that we all know, which is the Akedah, we say in Hebrew. This is the binding of Isaac. And you've got Abraham looking quite distressed, and Isaac looking resigned. He's okay with it. But he's glimpsing over at the ram, and the ram has a horn which looks like it's on backwards, which it is. And there's a tradition that says that the ram's horn from this ram is the one that will be blown on the day of redemption. Here in the Bible text, it says here, let me tell you the story first. Abraham's servant is sent back to the land where they came from to find a wife for Isaac, and he returns with Rebekah. And Rebekah says to the servant, "Who is that over there?" She's pointing to the man by the tent. And the servant says, "That's my master Isaac." And at that point, she veils herself and slides gently off the camel. And the last scene is a scene we all know as well. This is Isaac, who's an older man now. He's blind, and he is blessing Jacob with the blessing that he meant to give to Esau. He's been tricked. So, this is a Torah binder, and it is one person's life story. And then we'll move on to another piece. Well, this is just what I call calligraphy whimsy. I love to do calligraphy in Latin letters, English, and in Hebrew. And this is a series that I did, just a few from the series. I would take a letter, and I'll find 3 words that start with G that somehow go together, that are evocative of something. So this one says, "Go gently gaze." And this one is a Y, and it says, "Yodel, yowl, yes." The Q says, "Quietly questing quirkiness." I think that describes me. Maybe not so quiet, but I'm always questioning quirkiness. And then the H says, hurry, happiness happens. And the Hebrew one actually spells something. It's a lamed and a vet, and it says lev, and it means heart. So you can see there's a heart at the top. Lev, heart. Onward. This series I call the Quill and Inkwell set. I illustrated 4 stories, and 3 of them actually had a quill and an inkwell in each story, in the story. That was completely by coincidence, if there is such a thing. Illustrating stories is a very interesting project. I'd never thought about it before. I love to read. I read short stories all the time, and I discovered that when you read in order to illustrate, you're reading differently. So this particular story, the main character is Dina, the story is called Family. This one, when I read it twice, I love the story. It's about 10 years in the life of a village and the cycles of harvest and procreation and birth and constant, recreation of life. I hadn't noticed this when I went back to read it in order to illustrate. Listen to this list. Water from the well, dark waves, overflow, steam curled up, life-giving rain, darkly gleaming water, moist, ice, current, riverside, winter rains, bathe, pool, water drawers, showers, peals of thunder, swollen river, tears drop by drop, dripping rain spout, raindrops, shedding tears, shipwrecked. There are a lot of images that have to do with water here. And so that is what set me in the direction of how I was going to illustrate this piece. So there's the rushing water, here's the rain. But everywhere that water was not mentioned, textiles were mentioned. It was an odd kind of thing, and here's my textiles. And the story I'm not going to go into, but it's just that this is one capturing several elements of one short story. So we've been telling stories here. We told the story of many people's stories, all gathered, encompassed into one panel. We told one woman's story with lots of pieces from her life. We told a man's story with 5 images from his life. And here we're telling everything there is to tell, or possibly, some of what there is to tell from one story. It's not one moment in time. It's several things in the story, all together in one place. And the same thing happens here. And here's a scroll. Remember we talked about scrolls before, so here's a scroll. So this woman asks her husband, who is a calligrapher, a man who makes scrolls, to make one for her because she's not going to have a child, it's clear. And he refuses. So I put the real story that I'm reading on the back of this scroll so as to honor her. Over here, it's another story, and here's the pen and quill, as you can see. Over here, here's the pen and quill in this story, and here's the pen and quill in this story, and here it is again in this story. And so, for instance, in this story, there's a mention of this woman who is ancient. She's living in Jerusalem. She's a wonderful person. And there's a line that says, the eyes of Jerusalem were on her, or something like that. So I put the eyes across the very top of the walls of the city of Jerusalem. or some part. It's not the walls of the city. But she comes from Eastern Europe. So I have in these windows that I've placed in here really a map of Poland, of Eastern Europe. And the same thing goes for this one here. This one there was no pen and quill, but since it was a story told and written, I just added it at the bottom here. And it has to do with a midrash. Midrash is a literary, creative form that Jews have of understanding text, where there's a curious word or a missing moment or an odd idea in the text, in the biblical text. We expand and expound on that in story form. And so there's a point where Sarah, who I mentioned earlier at 90 is giving birth, can't believe what has happened to her body, and she's just, covering her swollen breasts full of milk. And Abraham says to her, Abraham said to Sarah, "This is not a time for modesty, but uncover your breasts so that all may know that the Holy One, blessed be He, has begun to perform miracles." The milk gushed forth as from two fountains. Well, in my mind, as an artist, I immediately saw someplace in Florence, Italy, a Bernini sculpture in a fountain in one of the beautiful squares with fountains of milk coming out. So I went and found one. I didn't find Sarah and Abraham. I found two men, and one of them was holding two jugs, and water was pouring out of them. And so I cut him out, and I placed Sarah there, and I put some clothing on the man in the back, and he's holding a stick. I made it into a staff of a shepherd, and the pigeon is still there. This is a modern picture of Florence. The tourists are in the background, and there's Abraham and Sarah. And that's what I do when I come up when an image hits me, and that's how I interpret it. This is a sheep, someplace in western Massachusetts, I suspect. And he's here all by himself. He doesn't quite fit into this rest of this group, but he's here. And I didn't have a title for him, but I decided to place him in this little corner, and because of where he's situated, I decided to call this picture The Watering Hole. Hello. Now this is the part that I'm very excited to show you. I love everything I've shown you so far, but this is the pièce de résistance, the main piece that I have on display at the JCA. It is called The Women of the Balcony. There are 4 in a series, and I'm going to show you the 4, and I'm going to explain to you the story that goes behind it, because it's also a story. Now this is a story of a community. They all knew each other. And I believe my piece it honors the women of this particular balcony, and I'll explain. And I want you to focus on what colors you see and what brings the 4 pieces together. It should be the color of the fabric. So, this is the last and the 4th piece. The one behind, which we'll get closer to, is the first one. That's number 2 over there. And this tall one is number 3. Let's start with the story of what you're looking at. My husband, who's a book dealer, was invited to come to a synagogue that was closed, and to see if he wanted to take the books, if there were some books for him. So I went along, and we went to New York City, to Manhattan, to the northern edge of Manhattan, which is called Washington Heights and Inwood. And this is an area that was settled in the 20th century by a lot of refugees from Germany, German Jews. The synagogue that we went to was opened in about 1940 and was now closed. And the year we're talking is about 2006. And this was an Orthodox synagogue. Men and women pray in separate, they are separated at prayer. And in this particular building, the women were in a balcony and the men were downstairs. The balcony was shaped like a large U with pews along the three sides. And we saw no books that were relevant to our business. And so we looked around and we asked the person who was in charge, what about everything else? It looked like people had just gone to lunch and left everything. And the woman said, take whatever you want. That's a little unusual. My husband went up to the balcony, the women's balcony, and he calls up to me, he says, come quick. And I came running upstairs. Nothing's changed in 2 years, it's been empty. But the place, as empty as it was downstairs, felt completely populated upstairs. The pews were covered, every single seat was covered with a handmade, individually covered cushion. Each woman had reached into her remnant drawer and sewed herself a cushion to make the pew more comfortable. There was nothing that matched. It wasn't designed by a designer. It was each woman's whimsy and personal need. Now, these cushions had no intrinsic value, and that's why they got all left behind. We both sensed something special. We took a picture, not a very good picture, and then decided we could not leave the cushions. Why we couldn't leave the cushions? You know, there was nothing else of value that it was just a sentimental feeling, some kind of piece of nostalgia. We couldn't even quite describe why. We threw the pillows over the balcony and then put them in our car, and with a few other things that we took, including prayer shawls. A tallis is a prayer shawl, a man's prayer shawl. In an Orthodox synagogue, only men would be wearing them. And they are usually, or often, white with black stripes, and you'll see they are featured here. They end up representing the male, the masculine, and the fabric of the cushions end up representing the women, the feminine. I happened to have a friend who was a textile curator. I asked him, tell me about these fabrics. He said, take them off the cushions and wash them and I'll tell you about them, which is exactly what I did. And I started taking them apart, and they were extremely dusty, as you can imagine. So I went and stood and sat on my front stoop to do this. And I quickly went and got a camera, because what I discovered was that under one layer, a fabric was another layer, and sometimes three. So the fabric would wear out, the woman would cover the cushion again. And some of the fabrics were really quite interesting. Some of the stuffings were quite interesting, old children's clothes, stuff. I took pictures, and then I washed the fabrics, stacked them in a nice pile, and the textile expert came over, and he flipped through them like he would flip through the pages of a book, and he said, 1970s upholstery, 1950s dress, kitchen curtains, 1930s dress silk. He was able to quickly identify each of these fabrics. Then they sat for a long time until I came up with my plan. Okay, so this is number one. And this is the view, this vanishing perspective you see here. This is the view we had when we went up to the balcony and we saw all the pews covered with cushions. And that's what I reproduced here. Some other people may see other messages, and that's okay. I chose to put a seamstress, a woman, in the middle, and she's making one of the cushions. And she's making a cushion with the vanishing perspective stripe. It's a self-reflective kind of device to put into the picture an item that has to do with the picture. I'm playing. It's playful. And she's actually quilted and patchworked. It's not one piece of black fabric that has stitches down here to quilt the shape. I have actually no idea why I did this, but I did her in a completely traditional patchwork method, which is I did the drawing on a piece of brown stiff paper. I cut it up. I wrapped each one up with fabric, and then I whip stitched them together. And then you take the paper out, usually, and then it's all together. She doesn't need to be that way, but I'm telling you all this only because there's a lot of quiet work that's not necessarily visible, that's part of this. It's almost a meditation on this particular personage. And getting that position of the hand pulling the thread was something I had to work on. I actually asked my husband to photograph me just doing this. I would do this, I'd say, now, until I had just the look I was looking for, and it was a real look. Then I took the picture of me and enlarged it and sketched it out a little bit and put a skirt on, and she's supposed to be sitting on a stool. And then I accidentally put her in just as I drew her, which ended up making her backwards, which makes her into a left-handed seamstress, which is not what I am. But that's a whole other interesting subject of artists who do self-portraits. The only way they can do the self-portrait is to look at themselves in a mirror. And when you look in the mirror, if you produce what you see in the mirror, you're actually producing the opposite. So every time you see a portrait of an artist and he's left-handed or right-handed in the picture, you have to wonder, was this really, this artist is really the opposite of what we're seeing? Or was he so clever that he could do it backwards? Anyway, each of the fabrics you see here are the fabrics from the cushions, the actual fabrics. And I've made some black stripes in between just so that they are clear to see. Other people see ladders, other people see railroad tracks. All of it works if it works for you. These are refugees and survivors of Germany in the 30s and during the war. This is what this synagogue congregation was made up of. So these are the survivors. These are the remnants of German Jewry who are now in America, in New York, and reconstituting themselves in a congregation. When I did this, I had the feeling that I had a canvas that looked to me like a man's prayer shawl. And you can see some over there, just to give you a sense of it. They're laid out a little oddly, but I'll get back to that in a minute. Let's go back to this one. Okay? And in the corners of a traditional, of any tallis or prayer shawl, are fringes. This is right out of Exodus. It says you will wear fringes on the corners of your garments. The garments really are garments like Romans would wear. They're just large square fabrics that you put a belt around, that you wrap around. It's different ways of wrapping it, much as I'm doing right here. And you'll notice that there are fringes at the end of a woven piece. That makes sense to all of us, I think, at this point. But imagine if you took a longer fringe and you put it to the corners here, you would have a traditional Jewish prayer shawl. And it's not with red that it's usually made. In fact, it's never with red. I put it red because it's a theme that I'm working off of, this red thread, and I'm showing that this is not a real one. I'm doing a mock-up of one. The fringes are there to remind you of the mitzvot, of the commandments. That's specifically what there says in the Bible that they're for. And I thought, okay, well, what does an Orthodox Jewish woman have to be reminded of in terms of her mitzvot, her commandments? And some of them that are specific to women, that are specific even today to women, not in times past, is, well, up here on the top left, can you focus on that? Can you zoom in? This is not real. This is made out of phimo, which is a clay kind of thing. I have attempted to make an image of an umbilical cord. And why? Because it's another corded. This fringe has a sort of a macrame work. There's a cording, there's a weaving kind of process, there's a braiding kind of effect that's happening here. So I thought, what else is a cord or a braid in that I can use? And so an umbilical cord came to mind. So why? Because the laws of family purity, of procreation, all of these things are talked about in our legal system, in our religious legal system. And so an Orthodox woman would be observing these laws. On the opposite side, maybe you'll recognize it, except it's a really skinny one. It's a challah bread. So a Jewish woman would bake her bread, and today still, they will take off a piece of the bread and burn it completely as a symbol and a reminder of what happened during the temple days in Jerusalem, where the sacrifices for the Sabbath would be brought, and it would be meal and challah, and it would be burnt completely. Not only the breads, but the complete burning. And so in memory of, in honor of, as a memorial, as a link to the past, it's done today as well. So that's up there. And down here is a braid of hair, and these have to do with the commandments of modesty. An Orthodox woman will have her hair covered after marriage, and will perhaps cut her hair short just to make it more practical. And only her husband will see her with her hair. And so here's this other one. So that's the four corners of this canvas that I've set up here. What I was trying to do here was to talk about the upstairs and the downstairs, and the men and the women, and the symbiotic relationship between them, and the caring nature of their community. So if you remember, I said the tallis will represent the male, the masculine, and the men, and the cushion fabrics will represent the women. So here is a tallis, a prayer shawl. Somebody's wife or sister or daughter will make a bag to hold it in, to carry it to synagogue. And so this represents the caring female, the caring woman for the male. And over here you have the caring male. I've turned the tallis into a sleeve, holding the woman, the cushion. There are more details here, but I decided this was too literal. It worked, but it was a little bit literal. So I'll take you over to show you number 3 now. Okay, so here's number 3. I hope you can hear me from there, and we're far away, because it's 10 feet tall, so we had to back the camera up so you could see the whole thing. This is the same message that I gave in the one I just explained before. This one, I think, shows it more impressionistically. What you have is upstairs and downstairs. And now you can follow me, right? The women and the men, the stripes from the prayer shawls down here, the fabric from the cushions up there. They're in the shape of flowers, and these are the shapes of stems. You don't have stems without flowers, and you don't have flowers without stems. They're completely interrelated and interdependent, and that's how they live. Imagine that we are among the men here. I'm going to stand on this side. We're in the world of the men down here. And what is the action that you do to look up at your wife? Usually on the opposite side of the room, up. You go like this. And that's why I made it this tall, so that you would be inclined to incline your head and look up. The visual contacts in that synagogue between husbands and wives was across and up and down. They usually sat across from each other, so if this is facing east, the men are all facing this way, and the women are in benches here and here and here. And so the man who's sitting on this side is tipping his head up to look at his wife up there. And so they can say, how are you? Is everything okay? I think I'll go home and get lunch ready or whatever. And except for one woman who said, I always sat directly above my husband because I couldn't read the Hebrew and I wasn't always sure where we were. So I would look down at his prayer book and I would see by the pattern of the page what page he's on. And I always knew what page I was on. And all the other women who might be distracted near me, they would always count on me. They'd say, what page are we on? And I'm the one who knew. I had very little of the cushion fabric left. And I knew I had more to say, but I wasn't sure what. And I couldn't figure out what to do with so little fabric left. Now, I collect odd things, and I happen to have 12 display heads for sales, for selling hats, for a shop that would be selling hats. And I had these 12 heads for no apparent reason. I had them all stored away. And suddenly it hit me that I could make hairdos out of the cushion fabric. I thought, this will work because it is the most feminine thing on a dressed woman is her hair. So much so that in certain cultures, they're expected or required to have them covered. Right? We all know about that. Well, in the Orthodox Jewish world, not always, depending on the sort of strictness of it, women will have their hair covered, either with a hat or a wig or a complete scarf. Well, my women showed their hair but had hats. And I took each head, I decided that I needed to put them someplace. And I did what in certain synagogues, they don't have balconies, but they have a separate part of the room. And there will be a curtain of some kind between the men and the women. And it's called a mechitza. So I created this triangular mechitza. And you'll ask me, is there some meaning to this? Only after the fact. In order to construct a freestanding structure that was not going to veer and tilt and sway and go out of shape and threaten to fall, the triangle is the most secure construction. But after the fact, I can also say, well, I'm also picking up the triangle of the piece behind there. And the triangle is, in Paleolithic times, the symbol for the feminine, for the woman. A little triangle. So these women are 9. That no meaning to that. It just fits into this. And each one got a pillow fabric, a cushion fabric, and I created their hairdos. I like particularly making this one with her bun and her little piece of hair that's hanging down. And at first they didn't have hats. And somebody said, "Oh, what lovely hats you made." I said, no, these are not hats. These are hair. So to make sure that they understood, I put the hats on. I needed the hats anyway. But, I had fun designing it. Each of the fabrics I soaked in starch. And then I designed it. And I actually used a curling iron to make the curls that you'll see on some of them. And they all have slightly different faces and noses. I've added a little chin to some of them. I'll take you around afterwards to introduce you to each one. Then I had the interesting problem of figuring out, so what am I going to cover their faces with? Because they're just some gray plastic. When I got them, they had a black velvet bag on them. That's a little creepy. But to take the plastic and leave it, that was not so attractive either. I did not want to give them each a real, separate, realistic face. That was more than was necessary. And I also did not want to distract from the fabric, the cushion fabric. And I knew I had to stay in the neutral colors, black, white, and gray. And it took me a while to come up with this. This was rather a cerebral decision. But I knew about black and white. My husband suggested a newspaper. I said, what does that mean to anything? And they're in the synagogue. They're not reading the newspaper. Suddenly it hit us. Techinas. Techinas is a word that describes, that identifies prayers, personal prayers for women. And they were always in the vernacular. So if you lived in Poland, the vernacular for the Jews was Yiddish. And the prayers written for these women were in Yiddish. The German community did not speak Yiddish. They always spoke German. So this particular Techinas, personal prayer book that we found, was in German. And what are these prayers? They're prayers for my son who's in the military, for my husband who's on a business trip, for my daughter who's giving birth, for the taking of the challah that I mentioned earlier, for the lighting of the Sabbath candles. I called up an Orthodox rabbi. I said, how do you feel about me using it this way? He said, are you honoring these women? I said, absolutely. He said, fine. And so we made photocopies of the pages of the book, and they got applied to these heads. In other words, the women's faces are made up of their prayers. And the title of the prayer is across their lips. I'm very happy with that solution. It makes me feel complete, whole. It wrapped it up just the way I wanted it to be. Here we are. You see this fabric here? Let me show it to you over here. It's this one. This woman has curly hair. That's my curling iron. That fabric is up there. This elegant lady is wearing a silk hair Oh, this one here is, the prayer is, for those of you who can read German, is a prayer for a mother whose son is serving in the military. This one is a young girl. She should not have had a hat, but I ruined the top and I had to cover it. I didn't have any more fabric for her braid and her hair. She's got a braid. That's where my red beret went to. This one has a chignon, another bun, and earrings, and little stray hairs. And this one is for her husband who's on a business trip. This one is wearing all the fabrics. Her hair is made up of all the fabrics. There's always one in the crowd, isn't there? And this one is a younger woman with a more hip kind of hairdo, bangs. So different periods I've put together. I can't read German, so I have to, it's hard for me to tell you what each of these are. Some of them I know. And this is for lighting the Sabbath candles. There's just enough words so I can pull it together. And you can find that fabric again up there too. Let's see if we can find it quickly. Oh, I see it. There we go. What I wanted to do was to honor these women and their community that no longer exists, their congregation that no longer exists, to be specific. And I'm very happy that you followed me on this little journey and that I got to show the community some of my art and some of my vision. And thank you very much.